Hi, I'm Charlie Meadows. On behalf of the John Birch Society, we are at the state capitol in Oklahoma City. Joining me today is recently retired Oklahoma State Senator Randy Brogdon. Next to him is State Representative Charles Key from Oklahoma City. And then further around on the right here is State Representative Mike Ritze from Broken Arrow, Oklahoma. Welcome to this roundtable discussion, gentlemen. Many Americans believe that the federal government has become too powerful. It's outside of its boundaries as enumerated in Article 1, Section 8 of the United States Constitution. And they're very concerned about it. It's really led to a lot of frustration. And so with that frustration, they're trying to find answers. They're looking for what do we do to solve the problem of this runaway tyrannical federal government today. And so they're coming up with solutions. And some of these solutions could actually be, I think, real harmful to our nation and its future. So tell us just briefly, Randy, what is one of the most popular misguided efforts out there today?
Well, Charlie, not only misguided, but probably one of the most dangerous options that's on the table today are legislators and politicians around this country calling for a constitutional convention. I believe it would be devastating to the United States of America as our founding fathers gave it to us, but there is a move around the state to call for conventions. And we would be much better off to, if we want to amend the Constitution, to go through the amendment process, not a convention.
Charles, I want to ask you a question now. We're really seeing this ramp up right now, this effort to call a con-con. A lot of different groups, as Randy was saying there. Would you kind of just give us a little bit of the history of the ideas for a con-con?
Well, yeah, it's not new. It's been an idea that's been brought up many times over the decades. It goes back to the 60s and the 70s when people got concerned about the federal government growing bigger and bigger, debt problems, continually going outside the bounds of the Constitution. And so this is not a new idea. It's something that's been proposed for probably 30 or 40 years.
Over the years, there's been a real struggle between advocates of the Constitutional Convention and those of us that are opposed to a Constitutional Convention. And that's created a lot of friction. What have the states done? What's been the reaction of the states over many years now?
Well, throughout the years, there have been a lot of states that have actually called for a convention, but in very recent history, and certainly here in Oklahoma, we have rescinded our previous calls for a constitutional convention for the reasons that we've already talked about. But the states are now, the state legislators are getting active. They're being proactive in writing legislation to rescind their previous calls. And I would imagine there's a lot of elected officials in the state houses around the country that may not even know that their state has already called for a convention. So it would be good to rescind that this year.
I think, the first state to do that was back in 1988, if I'm not mistaken. I think it was Florida and maybe Alabama at the same time. And how many states have rescinded their calls for a con-con now?
16 so far, and Oklahoma, we wrote legislation 2 years ago, and we have rescinded our call very recently.
Okay. Now, I think it was 2 years ago we rescinded our call. Yet what happened in the session earlier this year, Charlie, and as far as maybe leadership rethinking that?
Yeah, how soon we forget. We had some leadership that brought up the idea of, calling for a con-con again, and we had a discussion in one of our meetings about that. It was brought up, and some of the leadership had forgotten that just the previous year we had rescinded that call for a con-con. So it was quickly put down by many of the members.
Mike, I want to ask you this. Can we compare a state constitutional convention to perhaps a con-con call from the states to amend the U.S. Constitution?
Well, states are autonomous, and they vary from state to state, and they have limitations on constitutional conventions. There are no limitations on the federal level, and they can call it, they can write it, and they can destroy the Constitution that we know as a precious document.
So are you saying, Mike, that if we did call a con-con, that it would be very difficult to limit it and regulate a Constitution?
I think history and historians have told us that it would probably be very difficult to limit it.
Okay. Charlie, I want to ask you a question now. Now, we've heard a lot of reasons as to why we need a con, such as a balanced budget amendment, term limits, line item veto, many different issues out there. If the states were to call for a con, how could the states set limits for such a convention?
Well, they really could not. Now, there's a lot of people that are proposing that the states could do that. And there's a lot of legislators that think that they could, and they could attempt to do it. But history tells us that when we've had constitutional conventions in the past, that it has never stayed on the single subject or subjects that it was supposed to address. It always ventures out into many other subjects. And in addition to that, we have a host of witnesses or experts, I should say, that have addressed this questions. Former Supreme Court justices, Warren Burger for one, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg, such well-known law professors such as Lawrence Tribe of Harvard, Charles Rice of Notre Dame Law School.
One of those is conservative, one's a liberal.
There's Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Conservatives, Liberals, that the majority agree that if you have a constitutional convention, you may think that you can require it to stay on a single subject, but you can't.
Randy, I want to ask you a question. Now, let's just say, for example, that the proponents of a con do win out and we convene one. Let's say it actually did a good job. Would there be a problem with that?
Well, I think there'd be a very serious problem with it because, in fact, it would set a precedence. And I believe it would make it easier and easier to have another constitutional convention. We haven't had one since 1787, and we've rocked along pretty well so far. And once a new convention is called, and like Charles said, everything would be on the table. And if everything didn't go quite the way that they wanted at that time, they could come right back and call another one. And I think we would be in danger of almost having a perpetual convention. And again, that would just destroy the very fabric of our country.
So would you say then that citizen activists maybe that are in organizations that are pushing for a con, maybe they'd be a lot better off just working on their individual U.S. congressman to accomplish something like that?
Absolutely.
Is that a reasonable thought?
Absolutely. Yes, I think it's very important to change the process the simplest way possible, the least expensive, the less problems going through the process.
Now, Mike, I want to ask you another question. Some of those that are wanting a con right now are referring to our form of government as a democracy. Now, isn't that a little bit revealing with some of the problems that might exist within some of the people that are calling for these cons?
Well, by the inherent definition, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. And we have to realize that we are ruled by constitutional law, the U.S. Constitution, which this document gives us a system to make the corrections, if necessary, properly and not to waste the precious time of those involved in the process.
Let's just ask a question here that I think is real important. If there are some needed amendments, and amendments would be good, are you opposed, Randy, to amending the Constitution?
I'm not necessarily opposed to amending the Constitution. I'm opposed to amending it through a constitutional convention. For example, let's say that we had a constitutional convention because people wanted to have a balanced budget. Now, that sounds good on its surface, but if you do not have very specific language in the balanced budget amendment itself, saying the best way to balance the budget is to reduce spending. If that language is not in there, guess what? Then we're left with a balanced budget amendment, and the only other option is to raise taxes. So that is much better to be dealt with through the legislative process, not through a con.
What are your thoughts on that, Charlie, as far as should we be opposed to any amendments?
Well, there's probably very few people in this country that's against a balanced budget, and especially when you look at what the federal government has done over quite a number of decades. But, if we just looked at the last few years, the last 10 years, this is the number one issue, the economic issue, the fiscal issue. So everyone is concerned about the problem we have with the federal government putting us into debt to future generations. But again, this is not the answer, having a constitutional convention. There is another way, and Senator Brogdon just mentioned that. I think if people understood there was another way besides the constitutional convention and fully understood the pitfalls and the possible problems with a con, they would get behind this other method, which has worked more frequently and more often through the history of our country, and get behind that effort, because I think we might be able to get it done in that method.
Yeah. Now, perhaps part of that method, Mike, would be changing out certain elected officials in the federal government. And in this last election cycle, we just changed out a large number of them. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a good point. I think that what we have to look at is it's a constant process of retooling the elected as well as the electorate. Human nature is that repetition is the essence of learning, and we need to learn well the constitutions of our federal system as well as our state system to be able to make sure that our elected officials understand that. And if we do not continue to elect constitutionalists to the primarily the most important branch, I think, is the House of Representatives, because they control the money. And as a result, if we don't get people involved at a grassroots level to educate all of the people around them as well as the elected officials, then we've lost the game from the beginning. Back to the balanced budget amendment, it's an oxymoron. You cannot have a budget unless it's balanced. And that's one of the arguments that we have to look at, whether it's the line item veto or term limits or whatever it is. Whoever is changing the rules and then interprets the rules, unfortunately, we know the courts are not always tuned to the Constitution. And we have to realize that the states will have to take that back and initiate that in many instances and control it, rescind these con calls, and then educate the electorate.
You know, we've heard the saying before that all it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing. And let's just be honest, most of us would like to live our lives and enjoy life, enjoy our families and things like that. But every generation must fight for liberty. And there's no magic bullet, is there? I mean, there's nothing outside of being involved to a certain level and holding elected officials accountable. Have you guys, your elected officials, have you had that experience from your constituents?
You know, it's not easy. It never is easy, never will be easy, but if any people or any generation ever had it easier, it would be those of us here in the United States, with the legacy that we have that has been left to us, the form of government that we have. We actually can petition our government. We can call or write and go see our elected officials. The problem is too many people aren't doing that. And if they would, it has a tremendous effect. All of us here know that as legislators, when the people come up to this Capitol building, like they have at the Oklahoma Capitol and capitals all over the country, in thousands, in mass, it gets legislators' opinion, and they start listening to what the people are saying. And that's what needs to happen to fix this problem.
The silver bullet is the Constitution, and I love a quote from Thomas Jefferson. He said that I'd rather be exposed to the inconveniences of attending to too much liberty. In other words, he understood that our freedom and our liberty had to be protected and passed down generation after generation. And it's now our responsibility to do that. But we've become complacent. We've expected our freedom just to come to us naturally, but it's not. We have to protect it. And this is one of the things that excites me, realizing that the people now around this nation, certainly right here in the state of Oklahoma, have become extremely active in this political process, and that's encouraging to me.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I want to ask you a question here. I believe it was Vladimir Lenin, a man I have no respect for, said something I think we should pay attention to. He said an organized minority can always rule over a disorganized majority. What we've probably seen the left do over the last several decades is organize community organizers and such as that. How important is it to join with others, to become a member and to join with others in these efforts?
Well, the last count that I saw, we had about 7 Birchers in the Oklahoma legislature. There might have been a few since I counted, but I think we need to bond together. I've been a medical missionary, I've been a military veteran, and I think that the battles are won when you join together with others of like thinking. And there's a lot of great grassroots organizations out there. The Birch Society is the granddaddy. For 52 years they've been out there educating. They have boots on the ground with their field coordinators and local chapters, and the process of their research is not compared to anything that I've ever seen before. The reading is a sky limit. And what we have to do is continue to retool ourselves, understand that there's great people that we can choose from and we can work together, and we can do it. We can work together and win the battle. As I travel around the country giving talks as well as in the legislature in my own state and my own district, there's a lot of organizations that identify problems, but there's only very few, and the Birch Society probably being at the top, that identifies solutions. And to me, if you want to beat your head against the wall trying to recreate the same process, then that's fine, but I want to go to the sources and I want to understand how the problems can be solved. And again, as a physician, I don't like to treat symptoms, I like to treat the disease and cure it. And we have an opportunity now with the organizations now that people are aware, as Senator Brogdon and Representative Key said, we have people out there, there's a public awareness that I've never seen in over 30 years of involvement on my process at my level, that people are really coming around, and I know what you've done, Charlie, and helping us to kind of give backbone to our colleagues in the legislature, that people are watching. And it's because of the efforts of the grassroots and the Birch Society to educate people.
Okay. Mike, I want to ask you a question. What really should be a circumstance for amending the Constitution?
Well,
when should we ever do that?
Well, we have a term in Oklahoma, if it's not broken, then don't fix it. And the Constitution has well-governed, as my colleagues have said earlier, well-governed our country for over 200 years. And the amendment process is not a substitute for the legislative process. And as legislators, we work very diligently, dedicated to writing bills and trying to undo things that government has done to us instead of trying to do more things.
Aren't we seeing a lot of the people that are calling for these con-cons today wanting a shortcut from the work that needs to be done toward educating their personal representatives to legislate properly, or if there is a need, if there's some type of a problem, a structural problem within the Constitution?
Well, you know, I think one of the goals of the Birch Society is education. And we have to educate the electorate, we have to educate the elected, and to make sure that the process works smoothly, to make sure that we work together hand in hand.
And historically, those ideas and principles from our founding fathers and what establishes what good government is and what it's not, that's all available if we will just educate ourselves and then start working to educate neighbors and friends, isn't it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So, Charles, I want to ask you a question here. Some would say that we need these new amendments in place to force Washington politicians to do the right thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I understand that completely. I understand that because I have constituents and other citizens come to me as they come to a lot of legislators. They're frustrated, and they say, you know, gosh, why don't the legislature, or why don't you, Representative Key, do this or do that? We need something to force the government or stop the government from taking some kind of action. But the truth is, if the Congress, if the Senate, if the state legislature isn't following the Constitution, if it's violating it and continually violating it, passing one more act and through the process of a con is not going to make them all of a sudden start following the Constitution. They're probably going to ignore that also. And so that's really not the answer if they're already ignoring the Constitution.
So you're suggesting if we can't hold their feet to the fire right now, that passing more amendments might not be that effective?
I don't think so. I think if people would put their efforts in requiring those elected officials to follow the Constitution, it'll get a lot better result.
Well, I'm going to ask all three of this question. May all three have a perspective on this. And what do you really perceive as or propose as the remedy to many of the problems we see in government, such as the need for a balanced budget, politicians who seem to have lifetime tenure, and so many of the other problems today? Mike, why don't we start with you? What do you see as the
Well, I carry
real solution?
my little pocket constitution around when people ask me that question on the legislative floor or at any type of a forum that I'm involved with. I pull it out and I'll say enforce the Constitution, adhere to it, make sure that the electorate understands what this great, precious document is all about. Outside of the Holy Scriptures, I think it's one of the greatest documents ever written by man and recorded by man and ordained by God, and I think that we need to adhere to it.
You know, after the convention was over with, many of those that attended the convention and others, they actually believed it was a miracle. It was a tremendous effort and a tremendous document that was created. There's no doubt about that. Charlie, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I just thought of a quote from, I can't remember the congressman or senator that said this, but he said, "When I feels the heat, I sees the light." And, you know, what people need to do is realize the power they have in going to their elected officials and putting the pressure on them to do what's right and follow the Constitution. And when they do that, they'll get the results. Oftentimes, those elected officials will then start following the Constitution as the people require them. And if they don't, vote them out of office. Put somebody else in office.
But Charles, and maybe Randy wants to address that, you know, that takes just a little bit of effort on our parts to educate ourselves and to inform ourselves and then to communicate with our elected officials, doesn't it, Randy? And isn't the reality of it is our system works really well, and we've just got to be more involved. What are your thoughts on that?
Our system does work well when the people are involved, but the people have not been involved for a long, long time, but there is a resurgence, and we've seen it for the last couple of years with the Tea Party. The people are now getting involved, but the one thing that has been lacking for so long is the education process. Mike talked about this a while ago. The people need to educate themselves. That little document that he showed, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, understanding what the true rule of law is, and then use that information as we the people to educate our elected officials. They're the ones that ultimately will be casting that vote. So educating the electorate as well as the politicians is the key to solving all of our problems.
Okay. Well, we know that there are, like I said, we've said before, that there are a lot of organizations and individuals out there ramping up for this coming legislative session in the various states there, and they're intending to try to really pressure the various states to be a participant in a call for CONCON. And we think that we understand how dangerous and risky that is. So, Mike, let me ask you this. What would you recommend that citizens out here and legislators do if they understand that this onslaught is coming on? What's proactive?
I think the biggest thing we need to do, Charlie, is legislators need to rescind the CONCONs that are already out there, or if they get proposed again. And then informed citizens, activists that you work with, that we work with every day, need to encourage and educate their elected officials to get involved and to make sure that they make proper decisions to save the republic.
You know, Mike, I've known of accounts of just a handful of citizens in certain states, sometimes half dozen or a dozen, that have worked hard to educate their lawmakers.
It's very important. One person can make a difference. It's once said that one person has a sphere of influence of over 100 other people. Your family, your friends, your fellow workers, whomever, and as a result, you can inform people at a tremendous rippling effect or domino effect to make sure that they understand what is at stake is our freedom and basically our form of living.
Charlie, in our earliest history, James Madison was just one of our founders who had strong warnings about convening a constitutional convention. And tell us what that quote is, that famous quote. What was the thought from the father of our Constitution regarding calling a CONCON?
Well, it's kind of lengthy, but Madison, again known as the father of the Constitution, when he heard that New York and another state, I forget what it was, it might have been Delaware, was considering calling for a constitutional convention, just not too long after the original constitutional convention that convened to write our Constitution as we have it today. And he was so concerned about it, he wrote a letter to G.L. Tuberville, and I'd like to read what he said.
Okay.
He says, if a general convention were to take place for the avowed and sole purpose of revising the Constitution, it would naturally consider itself as having a greater latitude than the Congress. It would consequently give greater agitation to the public mind. An election into it would be courted by the most violent partisans on both sides, and would no doubt contain individuals of insidious views who, under the mask of seeking alterations popular in some parts, might have the dangerous opportunity of sapping the very foundations of the fabric itself. Having witnessed the difficulties and dangers experienced by the first convention, which assembled under very propitious circumstance, I should tremble for the result of a second meeting in the present temper of America. Those pretty strong words from Madison.
Yeah, really was. You know, I have recently heard, listening a little bit to Neil Bort's radio program, he really got on this bandwagon calling for a con-con. And then some people began to call in and talk about, you couldn't limit it to one issue. And then pretty soon, as he was still kind of wrestling with this idea, I'd hear a lot of people call in and say, well, we need to expand it to this, and we need to expand it to that, we need to, and I think Bortz is now kind of backing off of that, and I actually hear him making the case now that, you know, this would really be difficult to hold down, and just the natural part of human nature is, well, let's fix this, and pretty soon you got a runaway convention.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a real problem, isn't it?
Oh, yes. I mean, we'd like to think that our government works the way we learned about it in school, whether that's high school or college, and they're always doing the right thing. But the truth is there's lots of special interest and a lot of individuals, many that get elected to office, that have an agenda to radically change things. And a convention would bring all of that out, and there's no question about it.
Well, those are the words of our founding fathers, but actually, Senator Brogdon, a more contemporary person, Judge Robert Bork, who many consider to have one of the finest legal minds alive today, and maybe even in the last century, has also made some statements about this too. What is Judge Bork? What are his opinions on calling for a con-con?
Yeah, and his statements is just as serious concerns as what Madison had. He said, number one, you could not have a single subject con-con, and we've talked about that already today. And anytime, if we were to call a new convention, everything is on the table, including our Bill of Rights. And so, again, our nation, the way it's been governed since 1787, would be at risk. But if you stop and look at the original convention of 1787, Judge Bork recognized that it was actually a runaway convention. If they had a runaway in 1787, can you imagine what we would have in the 21st century? The best thing to do is to, if you want amendments to the Constitution, go through the amendment process and urge all the legislators around this country to rescind their calls for a constitutional convention if, in fact, they've already had one.
You know, I think probably one of the important things to understand there is we had some very brilliant men with very high moral standards that were those that attended our first constitutional convention. Today, we've moved away from so many of the values and things that were more unified at that point in time. Gosh, what do you think a convention might look like now today from the many states that are in so opposition, say, to the ideas of Oklahomans, the values of Oklahomans and Judeo-Christian values? Wouldn't this be, I mean, we just wouldn't have the same caliber of people there, would we?
I don't think we have the brain trust, number one. We don't have the moral convictions, number two. But the thing that we do have that gives me great expectations for our future, we do have 50 sovereign individual states, and we are still the greatest experiment of a republic that this world has ever seen. And we need to be governing ourselves at the state level, keep the federal government out of the state's business, and I think it will have a great positive impact on our future.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all three of you gentlemen for being here today. Thank you for your service to the state of Oklahoma. I've been an activist in this state for a long time and know the legislature and the legislators as well as probably anyone in the state. And I want to compliment you three men for not only being constitutionalists, but actually believing in the high moral principles of service and good government. And I just want to thank you so much for being a part of this roundtable today.
Thank you very much.